I'm going to talk this afternoon about predicting to prepare, but not necessarily to prescribe. And I want to acknowledge first my wonderful colleagues, Mark Gilthorpe and Peter Tennant, and our collaborator, Johannes Texter. All of the best bits of what I'm about to say are their responsibility, and all of the mistakes are mine. What to expect in the next 18 minutes or so? I'm going to kick off with 4 propositions and a provocation before moving on to talk about postdiction as prediction. Postdiction as prediction, and moving beyond that to the multiple uses through which prediction can be made to serve us through AI and machine learning. And then I'm going to end with some novel approaches to causal inference that provide us with the means not only to prescribe, but also to improve prediction. So I'm going to start with postdiction, talk about prediction, look a little bit about preparation, and then I'm going to move on to causal inference and its role not only in prescription, but also in prediction. Right, lots of P's here. So some four propositions. And to start with the first of these hopefully are things that we can all agree on. The first of these is that all data are socially constructed, both in the way in which we conceptualize these and the way in which we operationalize them. By conceptualize, I mean how we think about them. By operationalize, I mean how we do them, how we measure them, how we make them up. This is someone dead here, but that's live there, so that's fine. If you don't believe me, just cast your mind back to this gentleman, Donald Rumsfeld, and his rather famous quote about the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Now, what's important about the definitions for these 3 types of things is that we, that's humans, feature very strongly within this. So when he describes these, the known knowns are the things we know that we know. The known unknowns are the things that we know that we don't know. And you know the next bit, don't you? The unknown unknowns are the things we don't know that we don't know. All right. That follows on nicely to this notion that humans introduce prejudice, and I'm deliberately not using the word bias here because that's a very specific type of prejudice that enters in error within some of the work that we do. But introduce prejudice, essentially prejudice, into every stage of the construction, analysis, interpretation, and application of data. Every single stage. And there's this beautiful graph that some of you may have seen on the internet by Buster Benson. And he has classified over 200 cognitive biases that scientists have come up with over the last 50 years or so, and classified these under 4 what he calls common everyday conundrums. Too much information, too little memory, too little meaning, and too little time. And in order to cope with these conundrums, we take shortcuts, and these lead us into patterns of behavior and patterns of decision-making that lead to error and prejudice. My third proposition is to remind ourselves that all variables are associated with every other variable, to some extent, to a very small extent, to other extents, to a large extent, either by chance or by cause. And as a result of this, it's impossible to distinguish cause from chance alone using statistical analyses of observational data. And this really is an important tenet. Now, again, if you don't believe this, I'll introduce you to a paper that was published years ago in Nature. And this showed a similar pattern in the numbers of pairs of breeding storks in West Germany during the period between 1965, just after I was born, to 1980, just before I went to university, and a very similar pattern and decline in the birth rate in West Germany. Now, what we can say from this graph is that you might be able to use either of these 2 variables to predict the other. Yes, a very powerful predictive tool would be to know how many pairs of breeding storks there would be. We'd be able to know how many maternity outfits we might need in that particular year, and vice versa. But we can't tell from these data alone, and at this stage, we still can't know whether or not there's any causal relationship between these 2. And that's a crucial parameter to understand when we're conducting prediction using observational data. So here's the provocation. The provocation is that AI is predicated on using machine learning, and the reason we're very excited about machine learning is that it can, not always, but it can approach things in an analytical way apparently agnostically. In other words, it can leave human prejudice aside. Now, this might be quite helpful for postdiction, that is, the prediction of past events from past data, but it only has limited value in terms of preparation, even less value in terms of prescription. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case over the next 10 minutes or so. Okay. Before I share with you a model of data and start to play with it on the screen, I also want to get a sense of what it is when we talk about big data, quite what this means. And in some senses, this is a revolution. In other senses, it's not. I think the term big data doesn't even start to capture what's going on. Certainly not the way in which some people conceptualize data as emanating in a continual exhaust of information being exuded from all things, be they sentient or inert, or be they natural or artificial. And capturing these events when they happen, these data events when they happen, turns out to be absolutely critical for prediction and for prescription. So let us take an example of a collection of data. Here, a collection of data points. Each of these dots represents a different variable capturing a specific piece of information. And let's call this the sort of debris behind after the data exhaust, which we've swept up and we're starting to examine. Of course, within these data, there are likely to be some known knowns. These are things that we know about and that we've measured. So here they are. There are also going to be some known unknowns. There are things we know about that we don't have measurements on. So here they are. And then we're going to have a huge amount of information that we don't know about. And for that reason, we haven't got any information on. And here they are. The very first step that we need to take when we start to predict is to choose what it is we want to predict. And we have to choose something that's been measured in order to be able to model it. So we start by looking for what you might call a consequence of interest, or in epidemiology, what we would call an outcome. And here, in this instance, just for the ease of argument and for the type of diagrams I'm going to be drawing later, I've chosen this particular variable here to the far right-hand side of the state. What we then do is a number of steps. And the first step is that we examine, and you all know this, I'm teaching out of CogX, we examine the associations between all the other known knowns and this outcome of interest, and we examine these each in turn. Because that tells us something very interesting. It helps us to nail down this particular variable. And the next step, we use a variety of different techniques, including, most recently, algorithms and machine learning to do some very complex tasks to optimize the model fit, including, usually, the selection of particular variables that are available to it for inclusion in the model. So here we remove some of these steps because the model fit for this prediction improves if we remove those variables. And this is the symbolism that I'm going to be using throughout this talk. Now, what's crucial for us to remember is that every predictive model is specific to the geospatial and cultural context within which it's constructed. It's also specific to the circumstances prevailing in that context. And finally, it's specific to the correlation structure that prevails within the data we have access to. And all of these things are subject to change. It makes our postdiction quite difficult to use when future events and future contexts are different. So in this instance, I'm showing you some ways in which the data set might vary. And of course, these are just symbolisms of changing context, changing circumstances, and changing correlation structures. Nonetheless, when we try and look at prediction in order to prescribe, so we'll look at these models to try and identify which of these variables we've included in our predictive model might be useful targets for intervention, we do need to realize that we're unable to identify which of these variables are causes. And that's quite simply because some of them weren't examined as predictors, and these are those variables that we lost from the model. So we can't examine those because they're not even in the predictive model. And of course, some of them we know about, but we didn't measure them. There are larger numbers that we didn't know about, which we didn't measure. And then finally, we've got the ones that are in the model. But even those could be associated with the outcome simply by chance rather than as a causal effect. So this means that prediction is somewhat limited in prescription using this particular approach. However, postdiction can be useful for prediction, and prediction can be useful for preparation if we have knowledge of temporality. In other words, if we apply temporal theory to our diagram. So I'm going to digress briefly and represent the data in a way that will allow us to think about the timing of events. Because a proposition that I could have made at the beginning would be, I hope, something we could all agree, that in order for something to cause something else, it has to precede it. Okay, and that's a simple rule that we can all hang on to, regardless of the context. So let's just imagine that we're looking at a data set here of events that occur over time. So I've added on the bottom, I've added this timeline on the bottom, and I'm going to represent data exhaust as it happens. So hold on to your seats. This is really exciting high-tech PowerPoint approaches. So here are the data as the time clicks by, being added in a stream of data exhaust. The sort of information that we have, and it carries two sets of information. Each of these variables is telling us something about what happened, but it's also telling us about what happened at that time. Once we have this information, and just for the ease of argument, I'm going to transcribe my original model straight onto that, so it's going to look very similar to the last one. We have a series of past events, things that happened in the past, or if you prefer, it's the exhaust left behind after the events have occurred. That's what we're usually confronted with. Now, big data and AI techniques and our data capture techniques are going to allow us to continually monitor data streams in real time. And this, I think, is a very exciting opportunity for us as data analysts. But in this instance, when we superimpose our original predictive model onto this, we can start to identify how that might be useful for preparation. And as I say, for the ease of argument, I've simply arranged these as if they are in exactly that temporal sequence. So under these circumstances, when we use prediction through postdiction for preparation, we can identify a number of consequences of the variable that we have identified in our predictive model, in other words, our outcome. And a good way of thinking about this, perhaps, would be, and it's fairly brutal, of course, but when an army goes to war, it works out how many body bags it needs. When a hospital sets itself up and there are people who are ill and dying, it needs to know how large the morgue is. Okay, so predicting death rates, knowing how many people we need these facilities for, is clearly very important. At the same time, it's occasionally possible to identify in this type of a distribution of data over time variables that might be open for intercession. So these are variables we might be able to intervene with without disrupting the integrity of the predictive model, and nonetheless sort of sneak in just before the outcome to do some good. And an example of that might be if we were predicting deaths by heart attack, and we're able, therefore, to allocate, because we could predict when and to whom heart attacks might occur, where we might optimally allocate defibrillation machines or train people in cardiac arrest resuscitation. Okay, so let's look at how we might do this. Some of the consequences that you might want to predict operate after the original data set were collected, or at least considered. And these are really the consequences that were of interest. These are things that happen after we've stopped collecting data. Obviously, we can also predict some data that we've measured, but we've already measured it, so why would we want to predict it? And likewise, we could predict some of the data points here that we haven't measured, but we know that we haven't measured, and we could have measured if we knew that we hadn't measured them and we knew that we were going to find them useful. Okay, and I won't repeat that. But what we can't do, what we're not interested in doing, is really predicting consequences here at the end that we've measured and included in the model. They're going to disrupt the model if we include them as part of our subsequent consequence, because we're going to change events. Although, of course, this is postdiction as prediction. At the same time, when we look at intercession, sort of variables I think that we're looking at, although I don't have a proof for this, but I think we're looking at for variables a little bit like this. It's sitting there, it's unmeasured. We know that it's there, but we just haven't measured it. And it may just be something that we can introduce or alter. So in our original model of deaths by heart attack, this might be the availability of a defibrillator machine that you can then intervene on to catch it just before. We know where it's going to happen now, we've got the right model for predicting it, and we can intervene accordingly. You could, of course, argue that you could intervene on any of the variables that we either know about and have measured, or in fact, that we know about and haven't measured, but could have measured if we knew they were going to be useful. But to do so, I think, introduces a greater risk the further away from the outcome that you go, because the chances are that those variables might simply be affecting others that are in train. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. What we cannot do, though, is we cannot introduce predictors into this intercessionary model in the way that we would normally identify putative causes from predictors within the model. These are these black spots here that we wouldn't want to introduce and intercede in, because to do so would disrupt the predictive model. So far, so good. This, I hope, is common knowledge to everybody in the room. So then, a quick summary. If we want to move through postdiction to prediction, we need to remember that the predictive models we produce are specific to the context, specific to the circumstances, specific to the correlation structure of the data that we have available. But let's assume that all other things being equal, we've got a similar context, similar circumstances, and similar data structure. Prediction through postdiction for prescription is usually very, very difficult to do. All we can use it for is preparation for consequences. Occasionally, we might be able to intercede, but we can't identify which of the predictors are true causes, because any of them might be associated and introduced into the model by chance alone. Okay, so how do we do better at this? Well, I want to now introduce some novel approaches to causal inference, which have implications not only for prescription, but also for prediction. And these are based upon the work, particularly of Judea Pearl, but within our group, the original work by Johannes Texter and the applications that myself, Mark, and Peter have undertaken. But let me put another proposition to you. First of all, it's this, that agnostic machine learning may reduce prejudice during analysis, but it can't address prejudice in the conceptualization and operationalization of data, nor in its interpretation of prediction and predictors. To cut a long story short, you can't take a predictor and think that you found a cause. It's simply not a sensible thing to be doing. Okay, two more provocations. Firstly, if we're going to address the interpretation and application of prediction and predictors, we're going to need temporal theory. Firstly, to find consequences. Secondly, to identify potential intercessionary variables. And thirdly, to start getting our heads around potential causes, which I'll talk about. And that will rely upon causal theory. So far from being free from theory, AI will require and depend upon it, not only in the production and generation of data, but also in the interpretation of analyses in order to find out what a cause is. Okay? The second of these provocations is that if we can improve this for prescription, it will also improve prediction. And the reason for this being that if we can identify the causes within our predictive model, we know that those are unlikely to be different in different contexts, different circumstances, and different data structures. So we can then use that predictive model with greater external validity. We can use it in a greater range of places. It has much more utility. We've had presentations this afternoon on predicting income across London using photographic information. Fascinating. But I really cannot believe that this would work in Johannesburg, yeah, or in Mogadishu. Okay, so we have real problems with trying to make these data and these algorithms and these predictions travel very neatly in a way that can be useful for all of us. Okay, so let's go back to this. We've got the same time frame, the same data set. Modeling for causal inference, obviously we need an outcome just as we did before, but we also need in this instance to pick one of these known knowns as a potential cause, what we epidemiologists call an exposure of interest. Okay? And in this instance, I've chosen one for convenience here and labeled it in yellow, which I suspect with the sunshine you're not able to see. Although we're interested in that variable as the potential cause, that's not really the thing that we're modeling. What we're really modeling is the relationship between that variable and the outcome of interest. So it is actually the association between those two that we're interested in. We want to know what direction it is and how strong it is. And we will judge on the basis of that whether it is likely to be a plausible cause. You'll note, and this is important, you'd be surprised how many people make this schoolbook error, that the exposure precedes the outcome. The other day in the summer school, I was tearing apart one of my own papers demonstrating how rubbish it was from the 1990s and so forth. And I hadn't spotted it, but somebody in the audience spotted that, in fact, I had been predicting using a consequence of the outcome. And it worked really well, actually, predicting an outcome, but by something that happened. In fact, I was predicting how much weight people gained by how satisfied they were with their weight. Okay? So, get the idea. We all make mistakes. Then what we want to do is we want to try and figure out how complicated or how corrupted this relationship might be, as a result of all of the other potential causal relationships. And these are all potential causal relationships because any variable that precedes any other can be its cause. That's just a possibility. I'm not saying it is, but it can be. And so in this instance, we can see a number of variables this side of the outcome that are potential causes, and we see our consequences here, which are all caused by, or potentially caused by, the outcome. So far, so good. Then what we do is we impose temporal theory. And for ease of vision, there are two key points here. The time at which the outcome occurred, that dotted line, and the time at which the exposure occurred. To the right-hand side of that first line that I pointed out are all of the consequences. Between the two lines are mediators. These are variables that sit on the causal path between the exposure and the outcome. So they are part of the way in which, if the exposure is a cause, that cause may be mediated. And finally, we have variables on the far left-hand side, and these are the potential confounders. And this is because they're likely to be potential causes both of the exposure and of the outcome and introduce confounder bias. And this, in epidemiology at least, is something that we're particularly interested in. And again, earlier we heard about controlling for variables in order to clarify a signal in a predictive model. Okay. So when we do causal inference, we take these simple steps. Firstly, we eradicate the consequences. They're not going to be causes of the outcome, so we don't include them in our model. We also exclude the mediators. They are likely to introduce mediation bias, and there are a number of particular biases that can change both the strength and the direction of the association between the exposure and the outcome once you adjust for a mediator. And of course, you are essentially removing part of the effect of the exposure in the first place, because this exposure has a sequence of effects that ultimately affect the outcome. But we include the confounders. We include the confounders because by adjusting for them, we can reduce confounder bias. So, as a result, when you look at the model that we would produce for causal inference, so here are the variables that we're including in the model, it's very different to the model that we've produced for prediction using postdiction. Now, of course, I've chosen these models to figuratively stimulate this. But I can guarantee that if you tried this at home, and I would advise you to, do try this at home, you would find very similar patterns of changes were you to use a causal inference approach informed by directed acyclic graphs and causal theory, causal graph theory, and if you were to use agnostic modeling techniques. So under these circumstances, when we compare them, we're going to get different answers, and we're also going to identify different potential causes. And I haven't counted these, and of course I can make it up as I go along, but you can see that many of the potential causes here are not even featured in the predictive model below. Okay, so in conclusion, temporal theory-driven causal inference helps us to address not mistaking consequences for causes, not introducing mediation bias, and reducing the impact of confounding. So that's great for improving our ability to prescribe. In order to do this, we would go around each of the variables and model every single one as if it were a potential cause, and then examine that using causal inference. But at the same time, this is useful, as I explained, because it's useful to use temporal theory in order to identify consequences that we can prepare for, intercessionary variables that we might be able to tweak, and also for identifying which predictors are context or circumstance generic, because they're causes. They're not just chance findings. Now, I want to end with two modest provocations. One to my colleagues in critical data studies, and one to those of you working in AI. To my critical data studies folk, I would say that many of you would claim that time, like data, is a social construct. And if that's the case, might our perceptions of time, might the way in which we measure time or conceptualize or measure it, might that influence or introduce prejudice into causal inference analyses? It's a crucial question, because if it does, we're going to have to deal with that as well. And to my AI colleagues, I'd like to ask them this question, which may seem a little abstract, but we've represented variables here as if they were events, and they happen once, and that's it, and we can capture them. But in fact, variables come in all shapes and sizes. And the peskiest of all of these are time-variant variables, and a good example is height. So you can measure my height today, but it didn't happen today. You get that? Okay? So my height varied as I grew. You know, I wasn't always this height. Yes, I started off quite small and I grew bigger. And then over time, and in fact quite recently, I've started to shrink. Yes? So for a prolonged period of time in my adult life, it's exactly the same. You can measure it at any time. It'll be pretty much the same within a degree of error. And then in later life, it'll decline. And in early life, of course, there's growth. How might we use AI and big data to capture when these particular types of variables crystallize? In other words, where they tell us something very, very particular about an event and when it occurred. Thank you very much for listening. I suspect that much of what I've said you already know. I really hope that you don't feel I've been teaching you to suck eggs. But instead, by presenting some things that you know already, but in a different slant, it may have given you pause for thought. Thank you very much.